At 12 years old, Marcus Chen has learned that silence is safer than truth. In a system designed to protect him, he's discovered that speaking up only makes things worse, because the adults who are supposed to listen have already decided not to hear. Every night, he returns to a basement that smells like mildew and defeat, carrying bruises strategically placed where teachers won't see them, enduring abuse from the very people paid to care for him. His caseworker prefers comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. His foster parents have perfected the art of cruelty behind closed doors. And Marcus has documented everything in a notebook hidden under his mattress, knowing that evidence means nothing if no one believes you. But silence has a breaking point. When Marcus finally finds the courage to reach out to an investigative journalist who specializes in stories that fall through the cracks, he sets in motion a chain of events that will expose not just one abusive home, but a network of systemic failures that has been destroying children's lives for years. This is the story of a boy who refused to stay invisible, who transformed his pain into power, and who discovered that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. Because behind every case number, every file folder, every child warehoused in the system, there's a human being whose voice deserves to be heard. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like and share in the comments where you're watching from. Your engagement helps us bring more important stories like Marcus's to light. The rain hammered against the grimy windows of the social services office like an accusation, each drop a reminder of the storm brewing inside Marcus Chen's chest. He sat in the plastic chair, his small hands gripping the edge of his worn backpack, knuckles white with the effort of holding himself together. At 12 years old, Marcus had learned that silence was safer than truth, that keeping secrets was the price of survival. Mrs. Patricia Holloway, the caseworker assigned to his file, shuffled papers across her cluttered desk without really looking at him. She had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many broken children, heard too many horror stories, and had long ago stopped believing she could make a difference. To her, Marcus was just another case number, another checkbox on an endless list of troubled kids cycling through the system. "So, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the mechanical warmth of someone reading from a script, "your foster parents, the Thompsons, report that you've been having some behavioral issues. Fighting at school, breaking curfew, refusing to follow house rules." She glanced up briefly, her pen poised over a form. "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" Marcus stared at a water stain on the wall behind her, shaped like a bird with broken wings. He wanted to scream that the Thompsons were liars, that Mr. Thompson's discipline left bruises in places teachers never checked, that Mrs. Thompson looked the other way while counting the monthly check the state sent for his care. He wanted to tell her that the fighting at school started when other kids called him a charity case, that he broke curfew because staying out late meant fewer hours in that house, that the only rule he refused to follow was the unspoken one: shut up and be grateful. But Marcus had learned, through 3 foster homes in 4 years, that telling the truth only made things worse. Caseworkers didn't believe kids like him. They believed the adults, the respectable couples with clean houses and practiced smiles. The system preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. "No, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I'll try to do better." Mrs. Holloway sighed, a sound heavy with relief that she wouldn't have to dig deeper, wouldn't have to file more paperwork, wouldn't have to question the Thompsons, who were, after all, one of the few families in the county still willing to take in difficult older children. She made a quick notation in his file and closed it with a decisive snap. "See that you do," she said. "The Thompsons are good people. You're lucky to have them." Lucky? The word tasted like ash in Marcus's mouth. As he left the office, walking into the downpour without bothering to open his threadbare jacket, Marcus made a decision. He was done being invisible, done swallowing his voice, done pretending that the system designed to protect him wasn't the same system that fed him to wolves in sheep's clothing. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to find someone who would listen. Someone who would believe him. Someone who would care enough to look past the paperwork and see the truth. What Marcus didn't know, as the rain soaked through his clothes and the thunder rolled overhead like a warning, was that his determination to speak up would set in motion a chain of events that would expose not just the Thompsons, but a network of corruption that reached far deeper than one abusive foster home. He didn't know that there were others like him, other children trapped in the same nightmare, waiting for someone brave enough to break the silence. And he certainly didn't know that his courage would eventually reach the ears of someone with the power to burn the whole rotten system down. Someone who had been searching for years for proof of what everyone suspected but no one could prove, that some of the county's most respected citizens were profiting from the suffering of its most vulnerable children. The rain continued to fall as Marcus walked the 3 miles back to the Thompsons' house, each step heavier than the last. He passed the library where he used to hide after school, the park where he'd once believed he might have a normal childhood, the convenience store where Mr. Thompson bought his beer and his lottery tickets, spending the money meant for Marcus's clothes and school supplies. By the time he reached the house, a modest two-story with peeling paint and a sagging porch, Marcus was shivering. But it wasn't from the cold. It was from the rage that had been building inside him for years, the fury at being treated like he didn't matter, like his pain was inconvenient, like his life was worth less than the comfort of the adults around him. He stood on the porch, water dripping from his hair, staring at the front door. Behind it, he knew Mr. Thompson was probably asleep on the couch, surrounded by empty beer cans. Mrs. Thompson would be in the kitchen, preparing the dinner she would eat alone while Marcus was sent to his room. The bare, cold space in the basement that she called his bedroom, but was really just a storage area with a mattress on the floor. Marcus reached for the doorknob, then stopped. His hand hovered in the air as a realization crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. He didn't have to go back inside. He didn't have to accept this life. He could choose differently. But what were his options? Running away would only get him caught and sent somewhere potentially worse. Fighting back physically against Mr. Thompson would land him in juvenile detention. Complaining to Mrs. Holloway again would accomplish nothing. No, Marcus needed to be smarter. He needed evidence. He needed allies. He needed a plan. As thunder cracked overhead and lightning illuminated the neighborhood in stark white flashes, Marcus Chen made a promise to himself. He would document everything, find others who had survived the system, and build a case so undeniable that even the most indifferent caseworker couldn't ignore it. He took a deep breath, pushed open the door and stepped inside, carrying with him a new weight, not the burden of silence this time but the burden of purpose. The basement was exactly as Marcus remembered it, cold, damp, and reeking of mildew that no amount of bleach could mask. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that turned ordinary objects into grotesque shapes. His bedroom consisted of a stained mattress on the concrete floor, a cardboard box that served as a makeshift dresser, and a thin blanket that provided about as much warmth as a paper towel. Marcus closed the door behind him and sat on the edge of the mattress, his wet clothes clinging to his skin. Upstairs, he could hear Mr. Thompson's television blaring some reality show, the canned laughter a cruel contrast to the misery that permeated this house. Mrs. Thompson's footsteps moved across the kitchen floor in their usual pattern: refrigerator, stove, sink, table. The sounds of a normal household performing normal routines, except nothing about this place was normal. He reached under the mattress and pulled out a small notebook he'd stolen from the school supply closet 3 weeks ago. Its pages were already half filled with observations written in his careful handwriting. Dates, times, incidents, conversations. Evidence. Every time Mr. Thompson raised his hand. Every meal he was denied. Every cent Mrs. Thompson spent on herself while Marcus wore shoes with holes in them. Every lie they told the caseworker. Marcus opened to a fresh page and began to write, his hand shaking slightly from the cold and from the adrenaline still coursing through his system. He documented today's meeting with Mrs. Holloway, noting her indifference, her obvious relief when he didn't push back, her casual dismissal of his situation. He wrote down the exact words she'd used: "The Thompsons are good people. You're lucky to have them." The irony of those words burned in his chest. Lucky. He'd been called lucky when his mother died of an overdose 4 years ago, because at least he'd been found quickly and placed with the Johnsons. Lucky when the Johnsons divorced and he'd been moved to the Martinez family. Lucky when Mr. Martinez lost his job and decided foster kids were an expense he couldn't afford. Lucky, 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 as if being shuffled from home to home like an unwanted piece of furniture was some kind of blessing. A knock on the basement door made Marcus quickly shove the notebook back under the mattress. His heart hammered in his chest as Mrs. Thompson's voice called down, syrupy sweet in that way that always preceded something unpleasant. "Marcus, honey, come up for dinner. Honey." She only called him that when Mr. Thompson was awake and within earshot, maintaining the fiction of the caring foster mother. Marcus climbed the stairs slowly, each step an exercise in steeling himself for whatever awaited him at the top. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of pot roast and potatoes. A meal that might have seemed welcoming in any other home. Mrs. Thompson stood by the stove, her bleached blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that made her face look severe despite her attempted smile. Mr. Thompson sat at the head of the table, his bulk spilling over the sides of his chair, his small eyes watching Marcus with an expression that couldn't quite be called hostile but was certainly far from friendly. "Sit," Mr. Thompson said, gesturing to the chair farthest from him. It wasn't a suggestion. Marcus sat, keeping his eyes on his empty plate. The food was served, generous portions for the Thompsons, a notably smaller serving for Marcus. He'd learned not to comment on this discrepancy. In this house, gratitude was expected and complaints were met with consequences. Mrs. Holloway called, Mr. Thompson said, cutting into his pot roast with more force than necessary. Said you were real cooperative today. Real apologetic about your behavior. Marcus nodded, knowing that speaking unless directly asked a question was dangerous territory. That's good, Mr. Thompson continued, his voice deceptively calm. Because we've been more than patient with you, boy. More than generous. We take you in, feed you, clothe you, put a roof over your head, and what do we get? Attitude. Disrespect. Problems at school. Each accusation was punctuated by the scrape of his knife against the plate, a sound that made Marcus's nerves stand on end. Mrs. Thompson remained silent, eating her dinner with studied focus, playing her role of the uninvolved bystander perfectly. Now, I know you've had it rough, Mr. Thompson said, and there was something almost mocking in his tone, as if Marcus's trauma was somehow amusing to him. But that don't give you the right to make our lives difficult. We're doing you a favor here. The least you could do is show some appreciation. Marcus's jaw clenched. Appreciation. They wanted appreciation for providing the bare minimum while collecting $800 a month from the state for his care. Appreciation for bruises and hunger and isolation. Appreciation for turning his childhood into a nightmare. Yes, sir, Marcus said quietly, the words tasting like poison. Good. Mr. Thompson seemed satisfied. Now eat your dinner and get back downstairs. We've got company coming over and they don't need to know we're fostering. The dismissal was clear. Marcus was an embarrassment, something to be hidden away when respectable people visited. He ate quickly, mechanically, tasting nothing. When he finished, he carried his plate to the sink, rinsed it carefully. Another house rule, leaving dishes in the sink meant losing dinner privileges for a week, and headed back toward the basement door. Marcus, Mrs. Thompson called out, stopping him. He turned to face her, and for just a moment, he thought he saw something like regret in her eyes. But then she blinked and it was gone, replaced by the same cold indifference she always wore. Don't make any noise down there. Our guests are important people. Important people. Marcus wondered if they knew that just beneath their feet, a child was being warehoused like unwanted inventory. He wondered if they would care if they knew. Experience told him they probably wouldn't. Back in the basement, Marcus waited until he heard the doorbell ring upstairs, heard the false warmth in Mrs. Thompson's greeting, heard Mr. Thompson's booming laugh as he welcomed whoever these important people were. Then he pulled out his notebook again and continued writing. But this time he added something new. At the top of a fresh page he wrote, people who might help. It was a short list, painfully short. His teachers were mandatory reporters, but they'd never questioned the Thompson stories before. The school counselor had suggested Marcus needed to adjust his attitude and be more grateful for his opportunities. The police had come once when a neighbor reported shouting, but they'd accepted the Thompsons' explanation that Marcus had been throwing a tantrum. No, Marcus realized he couldn't rely on the adults who were supposed to protect him. They'd proven time and time again that they either didn't see what was happening or didn't care enough to intervene. He needed to find someone else. Someone outside the system. Someone with nothing to lose by telling the truth. His mind wandered to the other kids he'd seen cycling through foster care, the ones who'd aged out of the system or run away or simply disappeared into the cracks. They would understand. They would believe him. But how could he find them? The answer came to him with sudden clarity: the library. Miss Chin, the librarian who shared his last name purely by coincidence, had always been kind to him. She never asked intrusive questions, never treated him like a problem to be solved. She just let him read, let him exist in peace for a few hours. And she had access to computers, to resources, to information. Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow after school he would go to the library. He would start researching, connecting, building a network of people who had survived what he was surviving. He would find allies not among the adults who had failed him, but among the survivors who understood. Upstairs, the important people laughed and clinked glasses, celebrating whatever important people celebrated, completely unaware that just below them, a 12-year-old boy was planning a revolution. A quiet revolution perhaps, but a revolution nonetheless. Marcus closed his notebook and lay back on the mattress, staring at the exposed pipes running across the ceiling. For the first time in years he felt something other than despair. He felt purpose. He felt determination. He felt, against all odds, a flicker of hope. Tomorrow, he thought, everything begins to change. The morning arrived with the kind of gray, drizzling rain that made everything look washed out and defeated. Marcus woke before dawn as he always did, his body trained by months of hypervigilance to never sleep deeply enough to be caught off guard. The basement was darker than usual, the small window near the ceiling revealing nothing but the murky pre-dawn gloom. He dressed quickly in the same clothes he'd worn yesterday, now dry but still carrying the musty smell of rain and desperation. His morning routine was efficient and silent. Splash cold water on his face from the utility sink in the corner, run wet fingers through his hair, brush his teeth with the toothbrush he kept hidden in his backpack because leaving it in the upstairs bathroom meant it might, accidentally, end up in the trash. Upstairs the house was quiet. Mr. Thompson wouldn't surface for another 2 hours, and Mrs. Thompson typically didn't emerge until she heard her husband moving around. Marcus had learned to use these early morning hours as his own, a brief window of freedom before the performance of being a grateful foster child had to begin again. He grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl on the kitchen counter. His breakfast taken quickly and quietly, and slipped out the front door before anyone could assign him chores or find reasons to criticize him. The walk to school normally took 30 minutes, but Marcus had perfected the art of making it last longer, finding circuitous routes that bought him extra time away from the Thompson house. School was its own kind of prison, but at least it was a different prison. At Westfield Middle School, Marcus was invisible in a different way. Here, he wasn't the troubled foster kid that teachers whispered about in the faculty lounge. He was just another face in the crowded hallways, another student trying to survive until the final bell. The day dragged with excruciating slowness. Math class blurred into English, English into science, each period an eternity of sitting still and pretending to care about quadratic equations and symbolism in poetry when his mind was consumed with planning his afternoon trip to the library. His teachers noticed his distraction, but they'd long ago stopped calling on him. Marcus had made himself unremarkable, unmemorable, a survival strategy that served him well. During lunch, he sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria, picking at the subsidized meal that tasted like cardboard but was more food than he typically got at the Thompsons. He watched the other students laughing with their friends, sharing inside jokes, complaining about parents who cared enough to be annoying. A universe away from his reality. "Hey Marcus." The voice startled him. He looked up to find Sarah Mitchell standing beside his table, her tray balanced uncertainly in her hands. Sarah was in his English class, one of the quiet kids who sat in the middle rows and never caused trouble. They'd never spoken before. "Can I sit here?" she asked, and there was something in her voice, a hesitation, a recognition, that made Marcus nod before he could think better of it. She sat down across from him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah said, quietly enough that only Marcus could hear, "I know what it's like." Marcus's hand tightened around his plastic fork. "What do you mean?" "The foster system." Her eyes met his, and he saw in them a reflection of his own pain. "I was in it for 2 years before my aunt finally got custody of me. I saw your caseworker dropping you off once. Mrs. Holloway, right?" The mention of the caseworker's name sent a chill through Marcus. How much did Sarah know? How much had she guessed? And more importantly, could he trust her? "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said carefully, his default response to anything that touched too close to the truth. Sarah didn't push. She just nodded, pulled out a piece of paper from her backpack and slid it across the table. "There's a support group," she said, "for kids who've been through the system. It meets at the community center on Oak Street, Tuesday evenings. Anonymous, no adults unless you want them there. Just kids who get it." Marcus stared at the paper, at the address written in neat handwriting, at the words that might represent exactly what he'd been looking for. Allies, witnesses, people who would believe him because they'd lived their own versions of his nightmare. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because you have that look," Sarah said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much too young. "The look of someone who's planning something. And whatever you're planning, you shouldn't do it alone. None of you should have to do any of this alone." Before Marcus could respond, Sarah picked up her tray and walked away, leaving him with the paper and 1,000 questions spinning through his mind. Could he really trust the support group? What if it was monitored? What if someone reported back to the caseworkers? But then again, Sarah had been through the system. She would understand the risks, wouldn't she? The rest of the school day was a blur of indecision. By the time the final bell rang, Marcus had folded and unfolded Sarah's note so many times that the creases had begun to tear. He shoved it deep into his backpack and headed toward the public library, his original plan still intact even as this new possibility created complications he hadn't anticipated. The Westfield Public Library was a 3-story brick building that smelled like old paper, furniture polish, and possibility. Marcus had spent countless hours here over the years, hiding among the stacks, losing himself in stories about people whose lives were infinitely worse and infinitely better than his own. The library was neutral territory, a place where nobody asked questions and everyone was welcome as long as they were quiet. Miss Chen was at the front desk, checking in returned books with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd been doing the same job for decades. She was somewhere in her 60s, with silver-streaked black hair always pulled back in a neat bun, and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. When she saw Marcus, her face softened into something approaching a smile. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the faint accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language. "Shouldn't you be home by now? It's getting dark earlier these days." "I have some research to do," Marcus said, which was technically true even if it wasn't the kind of research she was probably imagining. "Well, we're open until 8. You know where everything is." Marcus nodded and headed toward the computer stations in the back corner of the first floor. The library offered free internet access, one of the few places in town where someone without money could access the world beyond their immediate circumstances. He logged onto one of the older desktop computers and stared at the blank search bar, suddenly unsure of where to begin. He started with simple searches: foster care abuse, reporting foster parents, former foster children support groups. The results were overwhelming. Thousands of articles, forums, advocacy groups, horror stories that made his own situation seem almost mild by comparison. He read through testimonials from adults who'd survived the system, many of them describing experiences eerily similar to his own. The neglect, the abuse, the indifference of case workers, the feeling of being utterly alone in a system supposedly designed to protect them. But he also found something else: stories of survivors who'd fought back, who'd documented their experiences, who'd found lawyers willing to take on corrupt foster agencies, who'd exposed networks of abuse and forced systemic change. It had happened before. Could happen again. Marcus pulled out his notebook and began taking notes, filling page after page with website addresses, organization names, legal precedents, strategies that had worked for others. He was so absorbed in his research that he didn't notice Miss Chen approaching until she was standing right beside him. "Marcus," she said gently, "it's almost closing time." He looked up, startled to find that nearly 3 hours had passed. The library was mostly empty now, just a few stragglers packing up their belongings. Outside the windows, full darkness had fallen. "I'm sorry," he said automatically, the reflexive apology of someone conditioned to believe that taking up space was an imposition. "Don't apologize." Miss Chen pulled up a chair and sat down beside him, her movements careful and deliberate. She glanced at his notebook, at the pages filled with his research, and something shifted in her expression. "Are you in trouble, Marcus?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Marcus could lie, could deflect, could maintain the fiction that everything was fine. That's what he'd been trained to do. But sitting there in the quiet library, with this woman who'd shown him nothing but kindness, he found the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I need help," he whispered, and saying it out loud felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating all at once. "But I don't know who to trust." Miss Chen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes studying his face with an intensity that made Marcus want to squirm. Then she reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a business card, worn at the edges as if she'd been carrying it for a long time. "This is my daughter," she said, handing him the card. "She's an investigative journalist. She specializes in stories about institutional failures, systemic abuse, cases that fall through the cracks. If you have a story that needs to be told, she'll listen. And she'll believe you." Marcus took the card with shaking hands. Jennifer Chin, senior investigative reporter, followed by a phone number and email address. He looked up at Miss Chen, searching her face for any sign of deception, any indication that this was a trap. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you helping me?" Miss Chen's expression softened, and for the first time, Marcus saw past the professional librarian facade to the pain underneath. "Because 30 years ago I was a foster child too," she said quietly. "And nobody helped me. Nobody believed me. I survived, but not everyone does. If I can give you what I didn't have, someone who listens, someone who cares, then maybe some good can come from all that suffering." Marcus walked home from the library with Jennifer Chen's business card pressed against his palm like a talisman, its edges already softening from the sweat of his nervous grip. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks, and every car that passed made his heart jump, irrational fear whispering that somehow the Thompsons would know what he'd done, would sense the betrayal of seeking help outside their carefully constructed world of lies. It was past 9 when he finally reached the house, nearly an hour past his supposed curfew. The porch light was off, a bad sign. Mr. Thompson used darkness as a psychological weapon, forcing Marcus to fumble with the door in the shadows, never quite sure what awaited him on the other side. Marcus took a deep breath, steeled himself and turned the knob. The living room was illuminated only by the flickering blue light of the television. Mr. Thompson sat in his recliner, a beer can dangling from his fingers, his face a mask of controlled rage that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. Mrs. Thompson stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral, the look of someone who'd learned long ago not to interfere. "You're late," Mr. Thompson said, his voice deadly quiet. "I was at the library, sir. Doing homework." Marcus kept his voice steady, kept his eyes down, played the role of the apologetic child even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "The library closes at 8. Mr. Thompson set his beer down with deliberate slowness and stood up, his considerable bulk making the floorboards creak. "It's 9:15. You want to tell me where you really were?" "I lost track of time reading and then I had to walk home." "I'm sorry, sir." The backhand came fast, snapping Marcus's head to the side and sending him stumbling against the wall. His cheek exploded with pain, the familiar sharp sting followed by the duller ache that he knew would blossom into a bruise by morning. He'd learned not to cry out, not to give Mr. Thompson the satisfaction of seeing pain. "You think I'm stupid?" Mr. Thompson advanced, looming over Marcus with the casual menace of someone who knew his power was absolute within these walls. "You think I don't know you're plotting something? I see the way you look at me, boy. Like you're better than us. Like we're not good enough for you." Marcus pressed himself against the wall, making himself as small as possible while his mind raced. Did Mr. Thompson actually know something, or was this just his usual paranoia fueled by alcohol and the need to assert dominance? Either way, Marcus had to de-escalate before things got worse. "I'm not plotting anything," Marcus said, injecting as much submission into his voice as he could stomach. "I'm grateful for everything you do for me. I just lost track of time. It won't happen again." Mr. Thompson studied him for a long, tense moment, and Marcus could see the man's internal debate playing out on his florid face, whether to accept the apology or continue the punishment. Finally he stepped back, picking up his beer again. "Get out of my sight," he said. "And if you're late again it'll be worse than a slap. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Marcus fled to the basement, his cheek throbbing, his hands shaking with a combination of fear and fury. Once the door closed behind him, he allowed himself to sink onto the mattress, pressing his palm against his injured face. A slap. That's what Mr. Thompson had called it. As if minimizing the violence somehow made it acceptable, made it less than what it was. Assault on a child who had nowhere else to go. He pulled out his notebook with trembling hands and documented the incident with clinical precision. Date, time, what he'd said, what Mr. Thompson had done, Mrs. Thompson's silent complicity. The bruise would be visible tomorrow. He'd have to wear his hood up at school, avoid teachers who might ask questions. The dance of hiding abuse was exhausting, a constant performance of normalcy over a foundation of terror. Marcus looked at Jennifer Chen's business card again, now slightly crumpled from being in his pocket. Miss Chen's daughter. An investigative journalist who specialized in institutional failures. Could he really trust her? Could he trust anyone? The years in foster care had taught him that adults were fundamentally unreliable, that they would always choose their own comfort over a child's safety. But then he remembered Miss Chen's words, "Because 30 years ago I was a foster child too. And nobody helped me." The pain in her voice had been real. The understanding in her eyes had been genuine. And if her daughter had grown up hearing those stories, maybe, just maybe, she would be different from the case workers and teachers and police officers who'd failed him so far. Marcus pulled out his phone, the cheap prepaid flip phone that the state provided for foster children. It had limited minutes and no internet, but it could make calls. He stared at Jennifer Chen's number, his thumb hovering over the buttons. What would he even say? How did you explain years of accumulated trauma in a phone call? How did you convince a stranger that your story mattered, that you weren't just another troubled kid looking for attention? He almost called 3 times, each time losing his nerve at the last moment. The risk felt enormous. What if Jennifer Chen didn't believe him? What if she called Mrs. Holloway to verify his story? What if she was just like all the other adults who'd promised to help and then disappeared when things got complicated? A soft knock on the basement door made Marcus shove the phone and business card under his mattress. His whole body tensed, preparing for round 2 with Mr. Thompson. But the voice that called down was Mrs. Thompson's, still carefully modulated in that fake sweetness that grated on his nerves. "Marcus, I'm leaving some ice in a bag at the top of the stairs for your face. Don't let it melt all over the floor." He heard her footsteps retreat, and after waiting a few minutes to ensure she was gone, he climbed the stairs and retrieved the Ziploc bag of ice cubes. It was a strange gesture, this small acknowledgement of his injury. Mrs. Thompson did this sometimes, offering tiny mercies that complicated Marcus's ability to completely hate her. The ice for his bruises. The extra blanket during winter. The occasional chocolate bar left on his makeshift dresser. Were these gestures evidence of some residual humanity? Or were they calculated moves to assuage her own guilt, to maintain the fiction that she wasn't complicit in his abuse? Marcus had stopped trying to figure out her motivations. In the end, it didn't matter. She still looked the other way when it counted. She still chose the monthly check over his welfare. She still let him suffer in silence. He pressed the ice against his cheek and returned to his mattress, pulling out the support group information Sarah had given him. Tuesday evenings at the community center on Oak Street. That was tomorrow. Could he make it there without the Thompsons noticing? The community center was only about a mile from school. If he told them he had an after-school study group, they probably wouldn't question it. They'd be happy to have him out of the house longer. Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow he would go to the support group. He would meet other survivors, hear their stories, maybe share pieces of his own. He would start building the network of allies he needed. And then, when he had enough courage and enough evidence, he would call Jennifer Chin. Sleep came fitfully that night, punctuated by dreams of being trapped in a house with doors that opened onto more rooms, endless basements stretching into darkness, voices calling for help that he couldn't reach. He woke multiple times, disoriented and sweating, before finally giving up on rest around 5 in the morning. The day at school passed in a haze of exhaustion and anticipation. Marcus kept his hood up as planned, avoiding eye contact with teachers and ignoring the curious looks from other students who noticed but thankfully didn't comment. At lunch, Sarah sat across from him again, this time without asking permission. "You're going tonight, aren't you?" she said, her voice low. Marcus nodded slowly. "How did you know? You have that look. Like you've made a decision." Sarah unwrapped her sandwich with studied casualness. "Want me to walk with you? The community center can be hard to find if you haven't been there before." The offer surprised Marcus. He'd gotten so used to navigating everything alone that the idea of companionship felt foreign, almost threatening. But Sarah's expression was open, genuine, without any trace of pity or judgment. Just the solidarity of someone who understood. "Yeah," Marcus said finally. "That would be good. Cool. Meet me by the west entrance after last period." The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. When the final bell finally rang, Marcus gathered his belongings with mechanical precision, his stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and dread. This was it. The first real step toward changing his circumstances. The first time he would voluntarily share his story with people who might actually understand. Sarah was waiting by the west entrance as promised, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her expression patient. Together they walked toward Oak Street, two kids bound by shared trauma, heading toward a place where maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't have to carry their burdens alone anymore. The community center was a squat, beige building tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The windows were covered with construction paper artwork from some children's program, and a bulletin board by the entrance advertised everything from yoga classes to job training workshops. Sarah led Marcus through the main entrance and down a hallway to a room at the back. Through the small window in the door, Marcus could see a circle of chairs, some already occupied by teenagers of varying ages. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, her hand briefly touching his arm. "Everyone in there knows what it's like. Nobody's going to judge you. Nobody's going to force you to share if you're not ready. Just listen if that's all you can manage today." Marcus took a deep breath, pushed open the door and stepped into a room full of survivors. The room was smaller than Marcus had imagined, with industrial gray carpet and fluorescent lights that hummed quietly overhead. About a dozen folding chairs formed a loose circle, and 8 of them were occupied by teenagers who looked up when Marcus and Sarah entered. Their faces reflected a spectrum of emotions: curiosity, wariness, recognition, understanding. These were faces that had seen too much, carried too much, survived too much. An older teenager, maybe 17 or 18, stood near a small table that held a coffee pot and a plate of store-bought cookies. He had dark skin, close-cropped hair, and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his hairline, the kind of scar that came with a story, the kind that couldn't be explained away as a childhood accident. He smiled at Marcus, and it was the smile of someone who knew exactly why Marcus was there. "You must be new," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone so physically imposing. "I'm Devon. I run this group, or maybe it's better to say I keep the coffee going and make sure nobody burns the place down." His attempt at humor broke some of the tension in Marcus's shoulders. "You don't have to tell us your name if you don't want to. Some people use nicknames. Some people just listen for weeks before they say anything. Whatever you need is fine." Sarah guided Marcus to 2 empty chairs and they sat down. Marcus's heart was still racing, but something about the atmosphere in the room, the lack of judgment, the shared understanding that seemed to hang in the air like incense, made breathing a little easier. "All right," Devon said, settling into his own chair and cradling a paper cup of coffee between his hands. "Let's get started. For our new friends, here's how this works. What's said in this room stays in this room. No names leave this space. No stories get shared outside these walls unless the person who lived it gives permission. We're not therapists. We're not caseworkers. We're just survivors helping each other survive. Cool?" Everyone nodded, including Marcus. The rules made sense. They created a container for truth-telling, a space where secrets could be shared without fear of consequences. "Who wants to start?" Devon asked, his eyes scanning the circle. A girl who looked about 15 raised her hand tentatively. She had pale skin, auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun, and nervous hands that picked at the frayed edge of her jeans. "I'll go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I go by Red here. That's not my real name, but it's what I want you to call me." "Hey Red," Devon said warmly. "What's on your mind today?" Red took a shaky breath, and Marcus could see her gathering courage the way he'd been gathering it for days. "My foster dad got arrested last week," she said, and the words came out in a rush as if holding them back any longer would poison her. "For what he did to me and my foster sister. He's been doing it for 3 years, and we finally told someone who believed us, and they actually did something about it." The relief in her voice was palpable, but so was the fear. "But now I'm scared," she continued, tears starting to stream down her face. "Because his wife is telling everyone we're liars. She's calling us manipulative. She's saying we made it all up for attention. And part of me wonders if people will believe her instead of us, even though we have evidence, even though the police believed us. I'm scared that somehow he'll get away with it." Marcus felt his throat tighten. Red's fear was his fear, the terror that speaking up would change nothing, that the system would protect the abusers instead of the abused, that courage would be rewarded with more suffering instead of justice. "Your fear is valid," Devon said, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd walked this path before. "The system is broken in 1,000 ways. But you did the hardest part, you told. You broke the silence. And even if the legal system fails you, which I hope it doesn't, you took your power back. You said, 'This happened to me and it was wrong.' Nobody can take that away from you." Others in the circle nodded, murmuring agreement. A boy across from Marcus, maybe 16 with bleached blonde hair and multiple ear piercings, spoke up. "My foster parents got away with it," he said matter-of-factly. "I reported them twice. Nothing happened. But you know what? I still don't regret telling. Because now I know that what happened wasn't my fault. I know I tried. And when I aged out of the system last year and got away from them, I could leave with my head up." The sharing continued around the circle, each person offering pieces of their story like broken glass that somehow formed a mosaic when laid together. Marcus listened, absorbing every word, recognizing elements of his own experience in their narratives. The neglect, the psychological abuse, the physical violence, the case workers who didn't care, the teachers who looked the other way, the police who believed the adults over the children. But he also heard stories of survival, of resilience, of small victories that meant everything. A girl named Jade who'd been reunited with her biological grandmother after 5 years in foster care. A boy called Tech who'd taught himself computer programming in the library and now had a scholarship to community college. A quiet kid named River who'd found a therapist who actually helped, who actually understood trauma. When the sharing came around to Marcus, Devon looked at him kindly. "You want to say anything?" he asked. "Or you can pass. First time here, no pressure." Marcus's mouth was dry. He'd rehearsed various versions of his story 100 times in his head, but now, faced with real people who would actually hear him, the words felt stuck in his throat. He thought about staying silent, about protecting himself behind the familiar wall of secrecy. But then he looked at Red, who'd been brave enough to report her foster father. He looked at the boy with bleached hair who tried twice to get help despite the system failing him. He looked at Sarah beside him, who'd extended a hand of friendship when she didn't have to. And he realized that silence had protected him from nothing. Silence had only made him more alone. "My name is Marcus," he said, and his voice shook but didn't break. "I'm 12. I've been in foster care for 4 years, 3 different homes. The current one." He paused, touching his bruised cheek unconsciously. "The current one is bad. Really bad. And I'm trying to figure out how to get out without making things worse." The admission felt both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff and discovering he could fly. "Tell us about bad," Devin said gently. "What does that look like for you?" So Marcus told them. Not everything, he wasn't ready for everything, but enough. He told them about Mr. Thompson's violence, always calculated to leave bruises that could be hidden or explained away. About Mrs. Thompson's willful blindness, her small mercies that didn't actually change anything. About Mrs. Holloway, the caseworker who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. About sleeping in a basement that smelled like mildew and defeat. As he spoke, he watched their faces. Nobody looked skeptical. Nobody suggested he was exaggerating or lying. Nobody offered meaningless platitudes about things getting better. They just listened with the deep understanding of people who knew exactly what he was describing because they'd lived variations of it themselves. "How long have you been documenting?" Devin asked when Marcus finished. "About 3 weeks. I have a notebook with dates, times, incidents. I'm trying to build evidence." Devin nodded approvingly. "That's smart. That's really smart. A lot of kids don't think to do that." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "But documentation alone might not be enough depending on how connected your foster parents are. You need an ally outside the system. Someone with power who can't be easily dismissed or pressured to back off." "I might have that," Marcus said slowly, pulling out Jennifer Chen's business card. "The librarian at the public library, Miss Chen, she gave me her daughter's contact information. She's an investigative journalist who specializes in institutional failures." Devin's eyes widened. "Jennifer Chen? The one who did that expose on the private prison system last year?" Marcus nodded, uncertain what that meant. "Dude," the boy with bleached hair interjected, "she's legit. Like actually legit. She won some big journalism award. If she takes your case, people will pay attention." "Have you contacted her yet?" Devin asked. "No. I've been too scared. What if she doesn't believe me? What if calling her makes things worse?" "Things are already bad," Sarah said quietly beside him, speaking up for the first time. "They're hitting you, Marcus. They're keeping you in a basement. How much worse can it get?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus realized she was right. He'd been so focused on not rocking the boat, on not making things worse, that he'd failed to acknowledge that things were already unacceptable. Already intolerable. Already dangerous. "Okay," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I'll call her. Tomorrow from the library where it's safe." "That's brave," Devin said. "Really brave. And whatever happens, you've got us now. You've got this group. You're not alone anymore, Marcus. Remember that." The meeting continued for another hour, with Devin sharing resources and hotlines, discussing safety planning, offering advice about navigating the foster care bureaucracy. By the time it ended, Marcus felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. Exhausted from the emotional vulnerability of sharing his story, energized by the realization that he'd found something he hadn't known he was missing: community. As people filed out, Devin pulled Marcus aside. "Hey," he said, pressing a small card into Marcus's hand. "That's my number. If things get dangerous, and I mean really dangerous, like you're scared for your safety, you call me. Day or night. I'll come get you. I've got connections with a few underground networks that help kids in crisis. It's not official, it's not legal, but it's safe. Understand?" Marcus looked at the card, then at Devin's serious face and nodded. "Thank you," he managed to say, the words inadequate for the lifeline being offered. "We look out for each other," Devin said simply. "That's what survivors do." Walking home with Sarah in the deepening twilight, Marcus felt different. The bruise on his face still throbbed. The basement still waited for him. The Thompsons were still dangerous. But now he had names and numbers in his pocket, stories that mirrored his own echoing in his ears, and the knowledge that when he finally made that call to Jennifer Chen, he wouldn't be speaking as an isolated, powerless child. He'd be speaking as part of a community of survivors who'd learned that their voices, together, could shake the foundations of the systems that had failed them. Marcus barely slept that night. He lay on his basement mattress staring at the water-stained ceiling, Jennifer Chen's business card clutched in his hand. rehearsing what he would say when he finally gathered the courage to call. Every version of the conversation he imagined ended differently, sometimes with her believing him immediately, sometimes with her dismissing him as another troubled kid seeking attention, sometimes with her promising to help and then disappearing like all the other adults who'd made promises they never kept. By the time dawn broke, Marcus had convinced himself a dozen times to make the call and talked himself out of it just as many times. The weight of the decision pressed on his chest like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. This wasn't just about telling his story anymore. After meeting the support group, after hearing Red's fear about her foster father potentially getting away with abuse despite her courage, Marcus understood that his choice to speak up or stay silent had implications beyond his own survival. School was a blur of anxiety and distraction. Teachers called on him twice and he had no idea what they'd asked. Sarah found him at lunch, took one look at his face and didn't bother with small talk. "You're going to call her today, aren't you?" she said, unwrapping her sandwich with studied casualness that didn't match the concern in her eyes. Marcus nodded, unable to form words around the knot of fear in his throat. "Want company? I could go to the library with you. Wait outside the phone booth or whatever. Just so you're not completely alone." The offer was tempting, but Marcus shook his head. "I need to do this by myself," he said. "But thank you. Really." Sarah squeezed his hand briefly across the table. "You're braver than you think you are," she said. "Remember that when your brain starts lying to you about how this is going to go." The afternoon dragged with the particular agony of anticipation. When the final bell rang, Marcus gathered his things with mechanical precision, his hands trembling slightly as he shoved books into his backpack. The walk to the library took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every step brought him closer to a point of no return, to a moment that would define the trajectory of his future. Miss Chun was at the circulation desk when he entered, and her face brightened when she saw him. "Marcus," she said warmly. "Back again so soon?" "I need to use the phone," he said, and his voice came out rougher than intended. "The private one, if that's okay." Understanding flickered across Miss Chen's face. She nodded and gestured toward the small office behind the main desk. "Take as long as you need," she said quietly. "And Marcus, whatever you're about to do, you're doing the right thing." The office was cramped, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of books waiting to be processed. An old landline phone sat on the desk, its cord coiled like a snake ready to strike. Marcus closed the door behind him, sat down in the worn office chair, and stared at the phone for a full minute before finally picking up the receiver. Jennifer Chen's business card was now soft and creased from being handled so many times. Marcus smoothed it out on the desk, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm his racing heart, and dialed the number with shaking fingers. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Marcus was about to hang up, convinced this was a sign that he shouldn't be doing this, when a woman's voice answered. Jennifer Chen. The voice was professional but not cold, efficient but not unkind. Marcus opened his mouth and found that all his rehearsed speeches had evaporated, leaving him with nothing but raw truth. "My name is Marcus Chen," he said, and was mortified to hear his voice crack. "Your mother gave me your number. She said you help people whose stories fall through the cracks." There was a brief pause, and Marcus could hear the sound of a keyboard clicking in the background. Then Jennifer's voice came back, sharper now, more focused. "Marcus Chen, you're a foster child?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you're calling because you need help?" "Yes, ma'am." Another pause, longer this time. When Jennifer spoke again, her tone had shifted from professional interest to something deeper, more personal. "Marcus, before we go any further, I need you to understand something. If you tell me your story and I believe you're in danger, I'm a mandatory reporter. That means I have to report abuse to the authorities. I can't promise that reporting will make things better, and I can't promise it won't make things worse in the short term. But I can promise that if you tell me the truth, I will do everything in my power to make sure your story is heard and that something changes. Do you understand?" Marcus's grip tightened on the receiver. This was it. The moment of commitment. Once he spoke, there was no taking it back, no pretending everything was fine, no returning to the familiar prison of silence. "I understand," he said. "And I want to tell you anyway." "Okay," Jennifer said, and he could hear her settling in, giving him her full attention. "Tell me everything. Start wherever you need to start." So Marcus told her. He started with his mother's death 4 years ago, the overdose that had orphaned him at 8 years old. He told her about the Johnson family, who'd seemed kind at first but grew tired of him within 6 months. About the Martinez family, who'd lost their financial stability and couldn't afford to keep him. About landing with the Thompsons 3 months ago and realizing within the first week that this placement was different, darker, more dangerous than the others. He told her about Mr. Thompson's violence, describing in clinical detail the pattern of abuse, the strategic placement of bruises, the psychological warfare, the threats of worse consequences if Marcus ever told anyone. He told her about Mrs. Thompson's complicity, her small mercies that didn't actually protect him from anything, her willingness to look away while collecting the monthly checks. He told her about Mrs. Holloway, the caseworker who preferred paperwork to people, who accepted the Thompsons' explanations without question, who seemed more interested in closing cases than in actually helping the children in her care. He told her about the basement bedroom, the insufficient food, the isolation from other children in the house when the Thompsons had company. And then he told her about his documentation, 3 weeks of careful notes, dates and times and specific incidents recorded in a notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. He told her about the support group, about meeting other survivors who'd confirmed that his experience wasn't unique, that the system was failing children across the county in systematic ways. Jennifer listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her voice maintaining that careful balance between professional distance and genuine concern. When Marcus finally finished, his throat raw from talking, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Marcus," Jennifer finally said, and there was something in her voice that made his chest tighten with hope. "What you've just described isn't just isolated abuse. It's indicative of systemic failure. A caseworker who doesn't properly investigate. Foster parents who've somehow been approved despite red flags. A system that prioritizes placement over safety. This is exactly the kind of story I investigate." "So you believe me?" Marcus asked, hardly daring to hope. "I believe you," Jennifer said firmly. "And more than that, I want to help you. But I need you to understand what that help is going to look like. First, I'm going to have to make that mandatory report to CPS and potentially to law enforcement. That's going to trigger an investigation. The Thompsons are going to know someone reported them. Your caseworker is going to have to respond. Things are going to get chaotic before they get better." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm ready for that." "Second," Jennifer continued, "I'm going to start my own investigation. I'm going to look into the Thompsons' history, see if there are other foster children who've passed through their home. I'm going to examine Mrs. Holloway's case files, see if there's a pattern of negligence. I'm going to dig into the county's foster care system and find out how people like the Thompsons get approved and stay approved despite complaints. This is going to take time and it's going to require your cooperation. Are you willing to work with me on this?" "Yes," Marcus said without hesitation. "Third, and this is important, Marcus, I need you to stay safe while all this is happening. Do you have somewhere you can go if things get dangerous? Someone you can call?" Marcus thought of Devon's card, the promise of underground networks that could help kids in crisis. "Yes," he said. "I have people." "Good. Keep their numbers with you at all times. And Marcus, I want you to call me every day. Even if nothing happens, even if everything seems fine, I want to hear from you. Consider it checking in. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Stop calling me ma'am. Makes me feel ancient. Jennifer is fine." He could hear the smile in her voice. "Now, I'm going to need you to send me photos of your documentation. Do you have access to a camera?" "The library has a scanner," Marcus said. "I could scan the pages and email them." "Perfect. Do that today if you can, and send everything to the email address on my card. I'm going to start making calls tonight. The wheels are going to start turning very quickly now, Marcus. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Marcus thought about the basement waiting for him at the Thompsons' house. He thought about Mr. Thompson's fists and Mrs. Thompson's indifference. He thought about Mrs. Holloway's tired eyes and practiced disinterest. He thought about Red at the support group, brave enough to report her abuse even knowing the system might fail her. He thought about all the children still trapped in situations like his, waiting for someone to care enough to fight for them. "I'm ready," he said and meant it. "Then let's burn this thing down," Jennifer said, and for the first time in 4 years, Marcus allowed himself to believe that justice might actually be possible. After hanging up, Marcus sat in Miss Chen's office for several minutes, letting the enormity of what he'd just done wash over him. He'd crossed the line from silence to speech, from victim to witness, from powerless child to active agent in his own rescue. There was no going back now. The machine of justice, however broken and unreliable, had been set in motion. He found Miss Chen at the circulation desk and asked about using the scanner. She showed him how to operate it, her movements gentle and patient, asking no questions but offering quiet support through her presence. Marcus scanned every page of his notebook, each one a piece of evidence, each one a small act of rebellion against the silence that had protected his abusers. When he finished, he emailed everything to Jennifer Chen with a subject line that read simply, "My documentation, Marcus." Then he packed up his things, thanked Miss Chen with a hug that surprised them both, and walked out of the library into the fading afternoon light. The walk back to the Thompsons' house felt different this time. His feet were lighter. His chest felt less constricted. He was still scared, terrified actually, but it was a different kind of fear. Not the helpless fear of a trapped animal, but the alert fear of someone about to enter battle, armed with truth and allied with people who believed him. The investigation moved faster than Marcus had anticipated. Within 24 hours of his phone call to Jennifer Chen, the machinery of official response began to grind into motion with a momentum that was both thrilling and terrifying. Marcus had expected weeks of waiting, of uncertainty, of wondering if anything would actually change. Instead, he got a text message from Jennifer at 7:30 the next morning that read simply, "CPS investigator coming to your school today at 2 p.m. They'll pull you from class. Be ready." Marcus stared at his phone screen in the dim light of the basement, his heart already racing despite having just woken up. This was really happening. The comfortable fiction that the Thompsons had maintained, the carefully constructed facade of being responsible foster parents, was about to be examined by someone whose job required them to look beneath the surface. The thought filled Marcus with equal parts hope and dread. He went through his morning routine on autopilot, his mind spinning through possible scenarios. What would the investigator ask? Would they believe him? Would the Thompsons somehow find out before the interview happened? Mr. Thompson had an uncanny ability to sense when Marcus was hiding something, and Marcus worried that his nervous energy this morning would give everything away. At breakfast, a quick bowl of cereal eaten alone in the kitchen while the Thompsons slept off another night of drinking, Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly to calm the trembling in his hands. He checked his backpack 3 times to make sure his phone was there, that Devin's number was saved, that he had the email confirmation from Jennifer proving she'd received his documentation. These small totems of support felt like armor against what was coming. The walk to school was surreal. Everything looked the same: the cracked sidewalks, the familiar houses, the crossing guard at the intersection near the elementary school, but Marcus felt fundamentally altered, as if he were watching his own life from outside his body. He was a boy walking to school, and he was also a witness preparing to testify, a victim about to name his abusers, a catalyst for change that might ripple far beyond his own situation. Sarah found him before first period, took one look at his face and pulled him into an empty stairwell. "What happened?" she asked. "You look like you're about to jump out of your skin." "CPS is coming today," Marcus whispered, even though there was no one around to overhear. "At 2. They're going to interview me." Sarah's eyes widened. "That's good, right? That's what you wanted." "I know. What if I mess it up? What if I say something wrong and they don't believe me? What if the Thompsons find out and—" "Stop," Sarah said firmly, gripping his shoulders. "You're not going to mess it up. You're going to tell the truth, the same truth you've been documenting for weeks. The same truth you told that journalist. The investigator's job is to believe you, Marcus. And even if things get hard, you've got people now. Me, Devin, the support group, Jennifer Chen. You're not alone in this." Her words helped, but they couldn't completely quiet the anxiety that buzzed through Marcus's system like electricity. The morning classes were torture. He couldn't focus on anything the teachers said, couldn't concentrate on the worksheets placed in front of him. His mind kept rehearsing what he would say, how he would explain years of accumulated trauma in a way that sounded credible rather than melodramatic. At lunch he couldn't eat. Sarah sat with him in solidarity, not pushing him to talk, just providing steady presence. Other students moved around them in the familiar chaos of the cafeteria, completely unaware that Marcus's entire world was about to shift on its axis. When the announcement came over the intercom at exactly 2 o'clock, "Marcus Chin, please report to the counselor's office," his whole body went cold. This was it. No more rehearsing. No more preparation. Just truth-telling and hoping it would be enough. The counselor's office was on the 2nd floor, a small room that always smelled like lavender air freshener and old coffee. When Marcus arrived, Mrs. Patterson, the school counselor, greeted him with a gentle smile that seemed tinged with concern. "Marcus, this is Ms. Rodriguez from Child Protective Services," she said, gesturing to a woman sitting in one of the chairs typically reserved for troubled students. "She'd like to talk with you for a bit. I'll be right outside if you need anything." Ms. Rodriguez was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and eyes that looked kind but also sharp, assessing. She wore business casual clothes, slacks and a blazer, and carried a leather portfolio that she opened as Marcus sat down. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice warm but businesslike. "My name is Sofia Rodriguez. I'm a CPS investigator, which means my job is to make sure children in foster care are safe and well cared for. I received a report yesterday about your current placement with the Thompson family, and I need to ask you some questions about your experiences there. Does that make sense?" Marcus nodded, his throat suddenly too tight to speak. "Before we start, I want you to know a few things," Ms. Rodriguez continued. "First, everything you tell me is confidential except in cases where I believe you or another child is in immediate danger. Second, my job is not to judge you or to get you in trouble. My job is to listen and to help. Third, you can take your time answering questions and you can ask me to repeat anything you don't understand." "Okay. Okay," Marcus managed to say. "Good. Now, I've already reviewed some documentation that was provided to me, so I have a general sense of the concerns. But I need to hear directly from you in your own words about what's been happening in the Thompson home. Can you start by telling me how long you've been living there?" This was the moment. Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak. He told her about arriving at the Thompsons 3 months ago, hopeful despite his previous disappointments that maybe this time would be different. He described the first week when everything seemed normal, or at least no worse than his other placements. Then he explained how things had changed once the honeymoon period ended and the Thompsons stopped performing for the caseworker. He detailed the basement bedroom, walking Ms. Rodriguez through its conditions with the precision he'd learned from documenting everything. The bare mattress on concrete floor. The single blanket insufficient for winter. The lack of heating. The mildew smell that permeated everything. The door that locked from the outside, trapping him down there when the Thompsons decided he needed to be out of the way. Ms. Rodriguez took notes steadily, her expression neutral but her eyes growing harder with each detail Marcus shared. Then he moved on to the physical abuse. This was harder to talk about, each word feeling like he was betraying some unspoken code of silence. He described Mr. Thompson's pattern of violence. The backhands that came without warning, the shoves that sent him crashing into walls, the grabbing that left finger-shaped bruises on his arms. He explained how Mr. Thompson was careful to hit places that could be hidden by clothing, how he never struck Marcus's face when school was in session, how the violence always came with accusations that Marcus had brought it on himself through his bad behavior or bad attitude. "Marcus," Ms. Rodriguez said gently, "do you have any current bruises or injuries I could photograph as evidence?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal the yellowish-green remnants of bruises on his upper arm. 4 oval shapes that perfectly matched the size and spacing of adult fingers. Ms. Rodriguez's jaw tightened as she took several photographs with a professional camera she pulled from her bag. "When did this happen?" she asked. 5 days ago. Mr. Thompson grabbed me when I came home late from the library. He was angry that I'd missed curfew. And has anyone else seen these bruises? Teachers? Your caseworker?" Marcus shook his head. "I wear long sleeves. Nobody looks close enough to see." Ms. Rodriguez made a note that Marcus couldn't quite read from his angle, but her expression had shifted from professionally neutral to something closer to anger. The righteous kind, the kind that suggested she took her job seriously and didn't appreciate people who hurt children on her watch. They continued for another 40 minutes, with Ms. Rodriguez asking detailed questions about meals, clothing, medical care, school support, and every other aspect of foster care that the Thompsons were supposed to be providing but weren't. She asked about Mrs. Thompson's role, and Marcus explained the complicated reality of a woman who was neither actively abusive nor actually protective, who existed in a gray zone of willful ignorance that allowed her to collect the monthly checks while avoiding responsibility for what her husband did. Finally, Ms. Rodriguez asked about Mrs. Holloway, and Marcus carefully described the caseworker's pattern of superficial visits, of accepting the Thompsons' explanations without question, of seeming more interested in maintaining placements than ensuring those placements were actually safe. When the interview finally concluded, Marcus felt hollowed out, exhausted from the emotional labor of recounting his trauma in clinical detail. Ms. Rodriguez closed her portfolio and leaned forward, her expression serious. "Marcus, I want to thank you for your courage in speaking up," she said. "What you've described constitutes serious neglect and physical abuse. Based on this interview and the documentation you've provided, I'm going to recommend immediate removal from the Thompson home. That means you won't be going back there today." The words took a moment to penetrate Marcus's exhausted brain. Won't be going back there. Immediate removal. He'd hoped for this outcome, but hearing it stated so definitively made it real in a way that was almost overwhelming. "Where will I go?" he asked, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "We have an emergency foster placement that specializes in short-term care for children in crisis situations. It's not a permanent solution, but it's safe and the foster parents are experienced with children who've experienced trauma. You'll stay there while we complete our investigation and work on finding you a more permanent placement." "And the Thompsons? What happens to them?" "That's an ongoing investigation that I can't discuss in detail," Ms. Rodriguez said. "But I can tell you that they will be interviewed, their home will be inspected, and their foster care license will be suspended pending the outcome of our investigation. They won't be able to hurt you anymore, Marcus. I promise you that." The emergency foster home belonged to a couple named Robert and Linda Harrison, and it was nothing like what Marcus had expected. Located in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and well-maintained houses, the Harrison home was a modest two-story colonial painted a warm yellow with white trim. A porch swing hung from the front porch, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Flower boxes beneath the windows overflowed with autumn mums in shades of gold and burgundy. It looked like the kind of house that appeared in feel-good movies, the kind Marcus had long ago stopped believing actually existed. Ms. Rodriguez pulled her car into the driveway and turned to face Marcus in the back seat. His entire life fit into the single garbage bag he'd hastily packed at the Thompson house under the watchful eye of another CPS worker. A humiliating reminder that foster children moved through the world with none of the dignity afforded to people who had real homes, real families, real belongings worth protecting. "The Harrisons are good people," Ms. Rodriguez said, her voice gentle but firm. "They've been doing emergency foster care for 15 years. They understand trauma. They won't push you to talk before you're ready. They'll give you space and structure in equal measure. But Marcus, you need to understand something. This is temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month at most, while we sort out a more permanent placement for you. Try not to get too comfortable, okay?" The warning was meant to be kind. Marcus understood that. She was trying to protect him from the disappointment of getting attached to another temporary situation. But the instruction not to get comfortable felt absurd. Marcus had spent 4 years not getting comfortable, not allowing himself to believe that any place was home, not daring to hope that any adults actually cared about his well-being beyond the monthly check his presence provided. He was an expert at not getting comfortable. "I understand," he said quietly. Linda Harrison opened the front door before they'd even made it up the porch steps. She was a woman in her late 50s with graying brown hair cut in a practical bob, laugh lines around her eyes, and the kind of solid, comfortable build that suggested someone who spent more time caring for others than worrying about her own appearance. She wore jeans and a sweater decorated with embroidered leaves, and her smile was warm without being overwhelming. "You must be Marcus," she said, her voice carrying genuine welcome without the false cheeriness that always set Marcus's teeth on edge. "I'm Linda. Come on in." Robert's in the kitchen making his famous lasagna, which he claims will cure all ailments known to mankind, though I suspect it's really just pasta and cheese like everyone else's. Ms. Rodriguez stayed for about 20 minutes, conducting what she called a transition meeting, where she went over paperwork with the Harrisons and established basic guidelines. Marcus would continue attending his current school. He would have access to his phone so he could maintain contact with his support network. He was expected to attend therapy sessions that Ms. Rodriguez would arrange. The Harrisons would provide appropriate clothing, food, and care. There would be weekly check-ins with CPS to monitor his adjustment. When Ms. Rodriguez finally left, promising to call tomorrow with updates on the investigation, Marcus stood in the Harrisons' living room clutching his garbage bag and feeling utterly lost. The house smelled like cooking tomatoes and garlic bread. Soft classical music played from somewhere, a piano concerto that reminded Marcus of his mother, who used to listen to classical radio while she cooked dinner, back in the before times when life had been normal. "Why don't I show you to your room?" Linda suggested, not making a big deal out of Marcus's obvious discomfort. "You can settle in and then we'll have dinner. No pressure to talk or be social if you're not feeling it. Sometimes a person just needs to decompress after a day like you've had." The room was on the second floor, at the end of a hallway decorated with family photos that spoke of years of memories, of a life lived with permanence and love. Linda opened a door to reveal a space that made Marcus's throat tighten unexpectedly. It was a real bedroom, not a storage area masquerading as one, not a basement with a mattress on the floor, but an actual room designed for a child to live in. There was a bed with an actual frame and a thick comforter in shades of blue and green. A dresser with 6 drawers, all empty and waiting to be filled. A desk with a lamp and a cup full of pens and pencils. Bookshelves lined with a mixture of young adult novels and reference books. Curtains on the windows that weren't just functional but decorative. a rug on the hardwood floor. Posters on the walls showing national parks and motivational quotes about perseverance and courage. "We keep this room ready for emergency placements," Linda explained, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the comforter. "We found that kids who come to us in crisis need immediate stability, a sense that they have a space that's theirs, even if it's just for a little while. The bathroom is across the hall. You'll share it with Robert and me, but we'll establish a schedule so nobody's fighting for shower time. There's towels in the closet with your name on them. Fresh ones just for you." Towels with his name on them. Such a small detail, such an insignificant thing, and yet Marcus felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. At the Thompsons, he'd used whatever ratty towel was left after everyone else had showered, sometimes still damp from someone else's use. The concept of having his own towels, marked with his name as if he were a person whose needs mattered, was almost too much to process. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice rough. Linda's expression softened with understanding. "You're welcome, sweetheart. Now, I'm going to leave you alone to settle in. Dinner will be ready in about 30 minutes. Come down when you're ready, or if you need more time, I can bring a plate up to you. Whatever you need, okay?" After she left, closing the door gently behind her, Marcus stood in the center of the room and allowed himself to simply breathe. He set his garbage bag down on the bed, his bed at least temporarily, and slowly unpacked his meager belongings. 3 changes of clothes, all worn and ill-fitting. His toothbrush and toothpaste. His notebook, now even more precious because it had been the catalyst for everything that was happening. His phone and charger. A photograph of his mother, the only one he'd managed to keep through all the moves, creased and faded from being handled too many times. He placed the photo on the desk where he could see it, then sat on the bed and tested its softness. It was the kind of mattress that actually provided support, not the lumpy, stained thing he'd been sleeping on. The comforter was thick and warm. The pillows were actual pillows, not the flat, lifeless rectangles that the Thompsons had provided. Marcus lay back and stared at the ceiling, which was painted a soft cream color instead of exposing pipes and water stains. He thought about Ms. Rodriguez's warning not to get comfortable, and realized with a bitter laugh that she needn't have worried. He'd learned long ago not to mistake temporary kindness for permanent safety. The Harrisons seemed nice, their home seemed warm, but Marcus knew better than to let his guard down completely. His phone buzzed with a text message. "Jennifer Chin, heard you're out of Thompson House. Emergency placement with the Harrisons? How are you holding up?" Marcus stared at the message, struck by the fact that someone was checking on him, someone who had no obligation to care but did anyway. He typed back, "I'm okay. Scared but okay. The house is nice. Too nice. Feels like a trap." Jennifer's response came quickly, "Not a trap. Just people being decent. It exists even if you haven't experienced much of it lately. Let yourself rest tonight. Tomorrow we keep fighting." Another text came through, this one from Sarah. "Devin told me CPS pulled you out. Are you safe? Call me when you can." And then Devin, "Hey Marcus, heard through the network you're at the Harrisons. Linda and Robert are solid. One of my first placements. You're in good hands. But call if you need anything. Day or night. I mean it." Marcus read through the messages multiple times, absorbing the evidence that he had people now, that his decision to speak up had created a network of care around him that hadn't existed before. He was still scared, still uncertain about what came next, still carrying years of trauma that wouldn't magically disappear because he'd been moved to a nicer house. But for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't facing his fear alone. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Marcus." Robert's voice called. "Dinner's ready if you'd like to come down. No pressure, but the lasagna really is quite good even if I shouldn't say so myself." Marcus hauled himself off the bed and opened the door. Robert Harrison was tall and lanky with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing an apron that declared him "World's Okayest Cook" in faded letters. His smile was understated, respectful of Marcus's emotional state without being pitying. The dining room table was set for 3, with real plates and cloth napkins and a centerpiece of fresh flowers. The lasagna sat in the center, steam still rising from its cheesy surface, surrounded by garlic bread and a bowl of salad. It was the kind of meal that families in television shows ate together, laughing and sharing stories about their days. Marcus had experienced meals like this so rarely that they felt almost alien. They sat down together, and Linda served generous portions without commenting on how little Marcus had on his plate at the Thompsons, without making a big deal about ensuring he had enough. Robert asked if Marcus wanted water, juice, or milk, treating the question as if Marcus's preference actually mattered. These small gestures of normalcy, of being treated like a person whose needs and wants deserved consideration, were almost harder to accept than the overt abuse had been. At least with the Thompsons, Marcus had known where he stood. This kindness was unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliar territory was always dangerous. "So Marcus," Robert said conversationally as they ate, "Linda tells me you're in 7th grade. How's school treating you?" It was such a normal question, the kind adults asked kids all the time, but Marcus found himself unsure how to answer. Should he talk about how he couldn't concentrate in class because he was always worried about what awaited him at home? Should he mention that he ate lunch alone because making friends felt pointless when he'd just have to leave them behind at the next placement? Should he explain that school was the only place where he felt relatively safe, and even that safety was conditional and fragile? "It's okay," he said finally, the safest answer he could conjure. Linda and Robert exchanged a glance that Marcus couldn't quite interpret, but neither of them pushed him to elaborate. They seemed content to let him exist in their space without demanding performance or gratitude or emotional labor he wasn't ready to provide. They talked to each other about mundane things: a leaky faucet that needed fixing, a call from their daughter who lived across the country, plans for winterizing the garden. Normal conversation that assumed Marcus might someday be comfortable enough to participate but didn't require it. After dinner, Marcus helped clear the table despite protests that he should rest. The act of washing dishes alongside Linda felt strangely therapeutic, a simple task that required no emotional vulnerability, just soap and water and the methodical process of making dirty things clean again. If only trauma could be washed away so easily. Marcus's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. How many children are suffering in silence right now, trapped in systems that were designed to protect them but have failed them at every turn? His courage to speak up, to document his abuse, to reach out for help despite years of being conditioned to stay silent. This wasn't just an act of self-preservation. It was an act of revolution. Because every time a child finds their voice in a world that tries to silence them, they create a crack in the foundation of injustice that others can follow through. Ask yourself, if you were 12 years old, alone, and trapped in a basement with bruises no one cared to see, would you have had the strength to fight back? Would you have believed that anyone would listen? Marcus teaches us that hope isn't naive, it's necessary. That speaking truth to power isn't easy, it's essential. That one voice, no matter how young or seemingly powerless, can shake the foundations of corrupt systems if that voice refuses to be silenced. The real question isn't whether Marcus will find safety and healing, though we hope with everything in us that he does. The real question is what we do with his story. Do we turn away, comfortable in the belief that these things don't happen in our communities? Or do we lean in, recognizing that children like Marcus exist all around us, waiting for someone to see them, to believe them, to fight for them? His journey reminds us that justice isn't something that happens automatically. It's something we create together, one act of courage at a time, one person willing to listen at a time, one system challenged and changed at a time. Marcus found his allies in a librarian who remembered her own pain, a journalist who investigated institutional failures, a support group of survivors who refused to let him carry his burden alone. Who are you willing to be an ally for? If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes to the realities faced by children in foster care, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this story with others. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Leave a comment telling us what Marcus's story meant to you, and let's continue this conversation together.